All right, hello and welcome back to Online English Class Honors English 2 students and Regular English 2 students. Hope you guys are doing well today. All right, before we get into our work for the day, I just want to quickly run back over the top of the week announcements and our assignment for OTN 1, which we're going to be exploring the first part of today by conducting an SQ3R for Chapter 1 of 1984. Okay, instead of the typical printouts of the slides that I would have, I just have them copied and pasted in note form because we're running a little bit low on toner in the high school office's printer. So let's just go ahead and jump into our top of the week announcements quickly. Obviously, we don't have vocabulary and grammar quiz. Your dominant homework for the week needs to be centered on reading Part 1 of 1984. Okay, so the novel that we're going to be studying throughout the course of this unit is called 1984. You need to have a copy of that, and you need to begin reading Part 1 of it. It's a pretty lengthy reading assignment, so you need to make sure that you're breaking it up over time. All right. By Wednesday at 3, you need to send me an email confirming that you've completed OTN 6. That'll be for a homework grade, which was analysis of The Solitary Reaper by William Wordsworth. Okay. You also just need to make sure that you are completing your OTNs as we complete them in class. All right. Obviously, this being our first one, OTN 1. Aside from that, over the next month and a half, you're going to write one last major essay. Okay, that is essay 4 for quarter 4. Okay, and it's going to be canon evaluation, which we'll be talking about in much more detail later this week. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about OTN 1 and our close reading of Chapter 1. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is conduct an SQ3R for the text for Chapter 1 of the novel, and then after we conduct our SQ3R, we're going to analyze the setting, the character development of our protagonist, Winston, and the narrative voice. Okay, but before we do that, we just need to conduct our SQ3R, make sure that we understand the basics of the text. Now, this first chapter is pretty lengthy. It's also very, very important, and it can be kind of confusing at times. So I just want to spend a bit of intentional time going through and explaining just on a basic level exactly what has happened, okay, and exactly where Winston Smith is, and what he is like, and what he does at the end of Chapter 1 that is so important. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into our SQ3R. All right, understand my writing is pretty small, so you'll just have to follow along with my voice as I read out what I've written. But in our SQ3R, we always want to start with an analysis of the speaker. Okay, so who is speaking? Who is talking? Well, Orwell, who is the author of the text, he's obviously the ultimate speaker. He's obviously the ultimate creator of the text. But in the text, who is actually speaking? Well, it's interesting. It's a third-person omniscient narrator. Now, a third person basically just means it's different than a first-person narrator. A first-person narrator, like, say, the narrator of Frankenstein, right? It's a story told from the first-person perspective of a character involved in the narrative. All right, a third-person narrative refers to the characters in the narrative by he or she or they and them. All right, an outside entity looking on or looking at characters that and the narrator is not directly involved in the story. Okay, so that's interesting. Little point of distinction, and importantly, they are omniscient. Now, that word omniscient is just a word that means all-knowing. The narrator knows everything about Winston's internal and external life. Okay, so the narrator is going to give us a kind of account of Winston's life as he attempts to rebel against the party. All right, the party is the entity that controls every aspect of Winston's life, and he's going to attempt to basically rebel against their authority through the course of the narrative. Okay, that's the basic story of what's going to happen in 1984. It's a story of rebellion. All right, now the genre, the style of the text. Well, it's a novel. Okay, and it's set in the near future in 1984. Okay, so that's where we get the title of the novel, 1984. It was written in 1949. Okay, so obviously 1984 is in our past, but it was in Orwell's future. So basically what Orwell is trying to evoke by setting the story in the near future is the mere possibility that a dystopian environment dominated by totalitarian governing structures is something that we are close to, or is always right around the corner, always an imminent threat in modern society, okay? And specifically, this kind of novel is called a dystopia, all right? I don't know if you're familiar with dystopia. There's some less serious kinds of dystopias out there, like, for instance, like the Hunger Games or Maze Runner. Those are examples of dystopian kinds of fiction. What dystopia means is the worst possible world, okay? So what this novel is going to meditate on at its core is what it would look like for a society, for a community, to be governed in the worst possible way, in the most dehumanizing possible way, all right, in a way that absolutely destroys, fractures the human spirit, okay? So what is the title of this text? Well, it's just chapter 1 of part 1, okay? So this is the exposition of the narrative. All right, so in a plot, the exposition, all right, the first act or the first phase of a narrative is meant to, right, introduce the setting, the characters, and the central conflicts of the narrative, okay? So to put it simply, the protagonist, the primary striver, right, the main fighter, Winston Smith, is going to come in conflict with the totalitarian government that is sort of the dominant part of his environment, all right? And he's going to attempt to recover his basic human rights by rebelling against them, okay? So the first chapter's description of the setting and the narration's characterization of Winston are going to depict the ways in which Winston, an individual in Oceania, all right, which is the fictional country that the story is set in, all right, it's going to depict the ways in which Winston's basic human rights have been taken from him. All right, what basic human rights are taken from Winston? That's part of what's going to be explored in chapter 1 and the rest of part 1. And then the small ways that he begins to take those back, all right, through rebellion. All right, so our central question here is, how does the novel's narration, which is to say not just the novel story, but the way the novel is narrated, the way the details are constructed, how does the novel's narration in chapter 1 illustrate the nature, all right, the nature, which is to say the significance or essence or meaning of the environment in which Winston lives and its effects on Winston's character, okay? Its effects on Winston's internal and external life, his spirit, his heart, his mind, and his body, okay? So let's go ahead and read, recite, and review essentially what happens in chapter 1. Now, chapter 1's pretty lengthy, so you're going to have to kind of like strap on your seatbelt and get ready for me just to summarize, to restate, to recite what has happened, the details of what has happened in the text. So in order to do that, what you're going to need to do is get a copy of the novel in front of you. All right. Now, there are copies of this novel for free available on the internet. If you just type in 1984 PDF and click around, you'll find your way to a copy of the novel. Hopefully you have a paper copy, all right? Hopefully you have this paper copy. That way we can all be on the same page. But if we're not, you just need to follow along closely and read along with me and note the basic details of what Orwell, through the narrative voice, is giving to us to set us up for the rest of the novel, okay? So, first paragraph introduces us to the central character, Winston Smith. Winston Smith, as we learn a little bit later on down the page, is 39 years old, so he's midway along the journey of his life. Okay, in literature, that is a kind of archetypical time in a man's life or an individual's life in which he experiences some significant kind of pilgrimage. Okay, it's kind of a time whenever a person might be confronted with a midlife crisis is sometimes how we would describe it. But similar to the pilgrim, who is middle-aged or midway along the journey of his life, in the Inferno, basically, right, Winston Smith is at the age where he is already a man, but he is beginning to meditate more seriously on what it means, all right, to be a man, on what it means to live, all right, in ways that are spiritually and morally enlightened. Okay, so Winston Smith, our protagonist, is 39 years old. Okay, all around him, right, we get this description of where he lives, the place where he lives. He lives in this place called Victory Mansions, and all around him are plastered these enormous posters of Big Brother, his big face, all right, of this heavy black mustached, ruggedly handsome dude of about 45 years old, and he is called, all right, in the society of Oceania, Big Brother. All right, and beneath the caption of the picture runs the statement, "Big Brother is watching you." Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the significance of that, but that's just everywhere, all over the place is plastered this slogan, "Big Brother is watching you." Okay, Winston enters into his apartment, and there, from an oblong metal plaque, okay, so think like a flat screen TV that is irremovable and you cannot turn off and is always watching you as you are watching it, is in his apartment. Okay, so this voice is coming from this plaque, and the plaque looks like a dulled mirror, which is just in the wall. All right, they call that a telescreen, okay? And you can't shut off your telescreen. It's always watching you, okay? A little more details about Winston. He's just a small, frail, meager guy, okay? So this is not like the story of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson overthrowing the Hitler-esque, Stalin-esque Big Brother. This is just a normal, everyman kind of figure who is small, physically frail, and meager of body. Okay, we get another sort of introduction to some of the aspects of the setting whenever we see a poster that says INGSOC. All right, it's another political banner. It is the ideology, all right, on which the party's control is based, and we'll talk more about the principles of INGSOC later. Those are going to be developed all throughout the course of part 1. And then we're introduced to these people who are watching the citizens of Oceania, constantly called the thought police. Okay? The thought police, obviously, are people who police the thoughts of the citizens. Now, how can you do that? Well, they read their body language carefully, they watch them constantly, and they are always vigilantly looking out for something called thought crime, which would be thoughts that were disobedient to the party. Okay, Winston's aware that any sound that he makes could be picked up by the telescreen, and he could be being watched at any given moment. All right, so he is constantly under surveillance. Okay, the setting continues to develop whenever Orwell, through the narrator, describes one of the basic ministries or branches of the party's governance of Oceania. One of it is called the Ministry of Truth. Okay, and the Ministry of Truth, the Mini-True for short, is based in London. Okay, so London is the chief city or the capital of Airstrip 1, which is the third most populous province in Oceania. So Oceania is obviously some kind of nation state that we don't really know that much about in 1984, and it's obviously comprised, or it has London, i.e. the capital of the old nation England, in it. Okay. Under, all right, the Ministry of Truth, there are these 3 slogans. All right, these 3 slogans are going to be very important, and they make no sense. War is peace, slogan 1. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. All right, so in other words, these statements are like war equals peace. No, it doesn't. Freedom equals slavery. No, it doesn't. And ignorance equals strength. No, it doesn't. All right. In fact, the greatest form of strength for humanity, all right, who are weaker than, say, gorillas and bears and typhoons and avalanches, the greatest strength of the human being is actually knowledge, all right, the ability to use mankind's brain to develop systems and shelters that empower them and make them safe. Okay, so in other words, all three of these statements don't really make sense. Okay, we'll talk more about them later. And they're the slogans of the party, the basic slogans of the party. Okay, so think of like the slogans of the United States. All men are created equal, all right, with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, e pluribus unum, out of many one. The slogan of the party is war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Okay, the other branches of Oceania's government are also introduced: the Ministry of Peace, which ironically concerns itself with war; the Ministry of Love, which ironically busies itself with maintaining law and order; and the Ministry of Plenty, which is responsible for economic affairs, or making sure that people have plenty of goods. All right. So the setting continues to be described. Winston enters into his home and he drinks some Victory gin and smokes a Victory cigarette. In other words, it would seem that all of the material aspects of Winston's life, from the alcohol that he drinks or the cigarettes that he smokes, smoking kills, don't smoke, but whatever, okay? That's not the point of the novel. From the food that he eats is all controlled by who? The party, okay? Moving on, right? He describes a little alcove in his apartment where he can sit, and he believes that he is outside of the range of the telescreen, okay? He thinks that this is a place where he can go to be private, all right? And then he begins to describe a revolutionary act that he has undertaken. He has bought what he describes as a beautiful book, and in that beautiful book there is no writing. In fact, he is going to use this beautiful book as a diary. Okay, and he knows, Winston Smith knows, that the thing that he was about to do, all right, which is to open up a diary, to begin writing a diary, to begin writing down his own personal thoughts, is not illegal, because nothing is illegal since there are no laws. But if he was detected, if he was found out doing this, then he is reasonably certain, or pretty sure, that he will be killed for it. Okay, so in other words, the party seems to punish diary writing with death. Okay, that sounds pretty intense. Okay, why would they do that? Well, we'll be talking about all of this tomorrow. Okay, first thing that Winston writes down is the date, April 4th, 1984. And he's filled with despair because he's not even sure that that's the actual date. He then considers who he's writing this diary for. Why is he risking his life writing this diary? He says, well, am I writing it for the future? Well, if I'm writing it for the future, then either the time period will be exactly the same as now, and no one will understand it, and this will be garbage that will be thrown away because nobody thinks like me. Nobody agrees with me. Everybody's a faithful adherent to the party, or things will have completely changed and it won't matter anymore. Okay, so he's confronted with this kind of desperate confusion before he begins risking his life to write this diary. Okay, on the next page he begins writing. Okay, and in this italicized portion, which is filled up with grammatical errors and run-on sentences and half-baked thoughts, he begins to sort of write down these scrambled thoughts about his memory from a previous evening where he went to the movies and watched, along with other party members, a movie that basically was just all about the violent killing of innocent individuals. And the party members were there watching and laughing and cheering until one woman stood up and said, "This is disgusting," and she was carried away. All right. He then, after his hand cramps up and he stops writing this sort of nonsense babble, he remembers why he actually got the diary and what he actually wanted to write about. And that was one of his memories from a previous day's 2 minutes hate. Okay, so what's the 2 minutes hate? Well, it's a daily ritual that party members are forced to engage in which they watch the face of a guy named Emmanuel Goldstein come up on the screen, and then everyone expresses a deep amount of rage and hatred for that guy on a daily basis, okay? And at the 2 minutes hate, he describes for us a woman by the name of Julia. He describes her as being attractive. Okay, he notes the ways in which one of her garments, a sash called the Junior Anti-Sex League, okay, so that's kind of weird. We'll talk about that later, was wound several times around the waist of her overalls, just tightly enough to bring out the shapeliness of her hips. In other words, okay, Winston is attracted to this woman, but he also says that he dislikes nearly all women, especially the young pretty ones, which is very strange for a single man to dislike attractive young women. He says he even goes so far as to say that he hates her. Okay, again, this is very strange. These are paradoxical kinds of emotions. He is attracted to her, but he hates her. And then he notes the presence of another individual named O'Brien. Okay, O'Brien is a member of the Inner Party. Well, what's the Inner Party? Well, the Inner Party is the group of people who are especially powerful, especially influential members of Oceania's society. Okay, and he notes the presence both of Julia and O'Brien at the 2 minutes hate that he is going to describe in his diary in the next few lines. All right, he believes that O'Brien might secretly not be politically orthodox. Orthodox just means pure. In other words, he believes that O'Brien might be a rebel too in his heart. Okay. Then continues to describe the 2 minutes hate in which the face of a man named Emmanuel Goldstein, who is the symbol of the enemy of the people or the enemy of the party, flashes onto the screen, okay? He's described as the primary or the primal traitor, the earliest defiler of the party's purity, and that all subsequent crimes against the party, all treacheries, acts of sabotage, heresies, deviations, sprang directly out of his teachings. In other words, Emmanuel Goldstein is used by the party as a symbol of everything that is against the party's control. And he is the object of the 2 minutes hate. They allow him, the party allows him to speak his doctrines, his anti-party doctrines on a daily basis, in order to allow the citizens of Oceania, who are forced to watch this on a daily basis, to vent their hatred and fear for him every day. Okay, so he begins abusing Big Brother, Emmanuel Goldstein, denouncing the dictatorship of the party. He was demanding the immediate conclusion of peace with Eurasia, another major country that we'll talk about later. He was advocating freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought. He was crying hysterically that the revolution had been betrayed. In other words, Emmanuel Goldstein is basically articulating all of the principles that are against the party's control. Okay? Before the hate had proceeded for 30 seconds, uncontrollable exclamations of rage were breaking out from half the people in the room. In other words, everyone is directing all kinds of anger and rage toward Emmanuel Goldstein, who is extolling the values and virtues of freedom. Okay, that's kind of weird. All right? He's depicted as the commander of a vast, shadowy army, an underground network of conspirators dedicated to the overthrow of the state. The Brotherhood, its name was supposed to be, okay? So these are supposed to, in the 2 minutes hate, this Brotherhood is depicted as the bad guys, the threats, the enemies, all right, the followers of the Satan-like Emmanuel Goldstein, who is rebelling against the good, benevolent authority of the godlike Big Brother. Okay, the teachings of Emmanuel Goldstein are rumored to be articulated in a book, The Book, that's just this mysterious book that is passed around in the hands of the Brotherhood. Okay, the hate rises to a fury. People are leaping up and down in the places and shouting at the top of their voices in an effort to drown the maddening, bleeding voice that came from the screen, Winston realizes or recognizes in a lucid moment, which just means in a clear moment, in a moment of clear thinking, Winston realizes that he, like the others, is shouting and kicking his heel violently against the rung of his chair, that he too is filled up with hatred and rage, and he can't even really control that hatred or rage. He's just sort of following in the crowd. He's not fully in control of his internal attributes, it would seem, his emotional reactions. Right? 1 minute he describes that his emotions were turned against Goldstein, the other against Big Brother, and then yet a little bit later towards the girl, Julia, who he will develop a relationship with later. Okay, so he's just all this anger, all this rage is just being vented in the 2 minutes hate. Okay, and then the face of Big Brother flashes onto the screen and reassures all of the people that everything is going to be okay, that Goldstein is not going to overthrow the party, and that the Eurasian army and the enemies of the people are not going to invade, and that everything is okay. And then the slogans come back on the screen: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And everyone in the room is bowing down in front of Big Brother, saying things like, "My Savior," and she's extending her arms toward the screen, and she's burying her face in her hands, and she was uttering a kind of prayer. Everyone in the room begins to chant, "B, B, 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 Big Brother, Big Brother," okay? And while this is all going on, Winston catches the eye of O'Brien just for a moment, all right? And there's a fraction of a second where Winston believes that O'Brien is on his side, that he knows what Winston knows, and that is that the party is tyrannical, the party is evil, that it's wrong, that it needs to be overthrown. He thinks for a moment that O'Brien is saying, "I am with you. I know precisely what you are feeling. I know all about your contempt, your hatred, your disgust, but don't worry, I'm on your side." Okay? He imagines O'Brien saying that. He wants to believe that O'Brien is on his side, that he's not alone. In his journal, he finds himself writing down back in the alcove of his apartment where he thinks he's out of sight. He thinks that he's writing, "Down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother." And in that moment, he knows that A, he has rebelled against the party, and B, he has committed something that is punishable by death in Oceania, which is called thought crime. He has thought rebellious thoughts, okay? He has begun the process of freeing his mind, his intellect, his soul from the tyrannical control of Big Brother and the party. And he knows in this moment that this very well could cost him his life. Okay, tomorrow we're going to analyze the significance of some of the things, some of the strange things that we've seen in this first chapter. Today, our job was just to acquaint ourselves with what happened. All right, hope you guys have an excellent day, and we will reconvene tomorrow.